Hello everybody. In this module we will be discussing the teleological argument for God's existence, also known as the argument from design. For this argument we will explain the reasoning and then consider a few of the objections that Paley tries to anticipate. Additional objections will be considered in its separate lecture. In this lecture we will, however, be looking at both the teleological argument and Paley's attempts to counter some objections. Paley's argument for the existence of God is an argument from analogy. This is a type of argument where an arguer claims that because two or more things are alike in some set of respects, they are likely similar in some other respect as well. For this reason, the argument may seem confusing at first. Throughout most of the argument, Paley never mentions God. Instead, he is talking about watches and watchmakers. As mentioned, Paley's argument is known as the teleological argument for God's existence. He was not the first person to make this argument. In fact, Aquinas made it as one of his 5 ways, the 5th one which we did not cover at the time. But Paley's argument was highly detailed and became famous. The word teleology comes from the Greek roots telos, meaning end, and logos, meaning reason. When one uses teleological reasoning, one is attempting to explain a thing or event by its end function, goal, or purpose. So, Paley asked us to imagine that we were walking along the heath. Since heaths are not real common in Southern California, I'll ask you to imagine that you are walking along the beach. As you stroll along, suppose that your foot strikes a large rock, like one of the many littered about a stretch of beach. Paley says that for all one knows, this rock might have lain there forever. That's to say there isn't really anything about the rock that cries out for an explanation. This should immediately separate Paley's teleological argument from the cosmological argument, which would try to move from even something like a rock to God's existence. A rock, however, does not have the right kind of properties for Paley's argument to work. Now imagine that you are strolling along the same stretch of beach the next day and your foot this time strikes upon a pocket watch. Paley says that this is different from the rock. It would not be reasonable to assume that it had been there forever or had somehow gotten there by itself. Why is that? You may wish to pause the video for a moment and think about this. Try to think some important properties that the rock might have that might make it different from the watch. Okay, so let's compare the two. The rock has no specialized parts. It might have swirls or patterns in the stone, but none of these have an apparent function. Sure, if you wanted to, you could create a function for the rock. You could take it home and use it as a paperweight. If it were big enough, you could sit on it like a chair and have lunch. Maybe you could use it to smash open a shell on the beach and look for pearls. But the rock's form and parts are such that it doesn't seem specifically tailored to work as a chair or an oyster opener, and nearly anything can be used as a paperweight. Likewise, there are no functional parts, and nothing in the watch seems to be interdependent. Sure, there may be parts of the rock, such as layers and spots, but they do not seem aimed at producing any specific end. The watch, on the other hand, has multiple parts. It has a chain, glass, brass gears, steel spring, and a protective cover. The internal parts have a complex organization. All of the parts seem to work together to perform some function, the regular turning of the hands. If part of the watch were removed, it would likely cease to function, or at least this is true with many of the parts, such as most of the gears or the spring, and so forth. What's more, the materials of each part of the watch seem well suited for its apparent function. The protective cover, for example, might have a glass shield. Especially during Paley's time, this would be one of the only available materials that a person could see through, but which would still offer protection. Brass is resistant to rust and works well for the delicate gears, while the spring is made of steel, which might not be as resistant to rust, but makes it perfect for holding potential energy to turn the gears. So, what conclusion should we reach about the rock and the watch? Well, according to Paley, the rock does not seem to require a design or designer. The watch, on the other hand, does exhibit design and seems to require a designer. We therefore can't conclude that the watch was just there naturally. We have to posit that somebody made it. Somebody sufficiently skilled to make something like a watch. But suppose that somebody is resistant to claiming that the watch had to be designed. Paley considers a number of possible objections, and we're going to look at a few of these. One possible difficulty of the reading, by the way, is that you might think that Paley is still presenting his own argument when he is considering potential objections. Here is the first. Paley considers this possibility, and please note that these are not exact quotes of Paley. He says maybe we don't know what a watch is, or anything that is capable of making one. But Paley does not think that this works as a response. He says that there are many things that we could not make ourselves, but that doesn't make us doubt their design. We still see the workmanship and apparent function in them. So Paley is pointing out that there are many things that we might not understand how to make, but still see are designed. He uses the example of turning an oval frame, which was evidently fairly complex at the time, but it could be anything. You turn on and use a TV, but it is unlikely that you could build one. Nevertheless, he would say that it is evident that a designer is required to build one. So, even if we do not know what a watch is or how to make one, we can look at the purposefulness of its parts and how they seem to interact and can conclude that it must have a designer. So, possible objection 2, Paley considers the following. What if the watch doesn't always work perfectly or sometimes goes wrong? So maybe the watch isn't keeping perfect time or runs down. Paley says that this argument doesn't work. He says that the purpose of the design of the watch is still evident. Even if it is badly designed, it still appears to be designed. Objection 3 considers that maybe some parts of the watch do not have a function or can be removed without causing harm or even end up improving the device. So maybe we can poke around and remove part of the watch and make it work even better, or maybe parts can simply be removed without causing harm. Paley first of all thinks that we might just not know what the purpose of these parts are. That doesn't show that there is no purpose. This is a questionable way of defending the argument, however, since his whole argument depends upon the apparent function of the watch. He also thinks that this would only show that there are unnecessary parts or ways to improve the device or design. It does not show, however, that the device had no designer. The apparent function is still evidence of design. The fourth objection is fairly odd. He considers this possibility. Maybe the watch is just like the rock. It is just one possible combination of matter, and it should be no surprise that it is arranged how it is. It has to be arranged in some way, and as a watch is just one possible way. But his response is that no person in their right senses would think this. The odds are too steep against a watch just forming through the random configuration of matter. So maybe you do not understand what he means by just a possible configuration of matter, so we will look at this argument a bit more closely. What the objection he is considering here is saying is that, look, when you have a lump of matter, it has to be configured, that's to say arranged in some way. With the rock, it is configured, maybe with specks and stripes. With the watch, there are springs, a case, and gears. That's just a different way of putting together matter. But Paley says that nobody could reasonably believe this. The odds against such a configuration are too steep. Maybe you could think of it like this. Imagine that a volcano is blowing up in the distance. All these minerals are thrown up in the air by the explosion, including silica, out of which glass is made, and metal ores, along with tons and tons of rock. Now imagine that all these blobs of molten material are blown up in the air and are cooling and are raining down around you as rocks. When poof, a pocket watch lands at your feet. Suppose that somebody thinks, oh, no surprise there. After all, the volcano contained the makings of brass and glass and steel, and this watch in front of you is just one configuration of matter, just like the rocks. It had to be configured in some way after all. Paley thinks that this is ludicrous. The fifth objection we will consider is that maybe there is a principle of order, that's to say a law of nature, that organizes material into watches under the right conditions. In case you do not understand what is being said here, this argument is suggesting that there may be some law or laws of nature that result in matter organizing itself as watches. Some things do seem to organize themselves. One might explain the layers of the rock, for example, by a principle of nature and sedimentation. So, even though they look like very straight, carefully drawn lines of material, this is explained by a process of sediment being deposited and hardening, not by design. But Paley does not think that this works for the watch. First, he says that we would have no idea of what such a law consists in. In other words, the person who is proposing a natural principle that organizes material into watches doesn't really have a mechanism in mind, such as we described with the sedimentation a moment ago. Instead, this person's law is just that, a law that makes watches. He also says that we know of no other mechanism or similar mechanism that could explain something like this. One of the reasons why I say that this is an interesting objection is that revisiting this one will be important. Paley was writing before Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, so a key objection to Paley's argument is that we now do have a mechanism which Paley at the time was unaware of, which seems to explain exactly this kind of complexity. But more about this later. Paley then asks us to imagine that the watch could reproduce itself. That's to say, suppose that the watch running alone assembled the parts of itself needed to produce another watch, and so the watches would multiply. Should this make us think that the watch wasn't designed? Paley says no. Instead, he thinks that our admiration for the design should increase, since this makes it even more intricate, purposeful, and complex. Even though one watch might be explained by being made by another, that's to say that now we know that these hypothetical watches reproduce, we can explain the watch on the beach by another earlier watch which produced it, he still says that the design calls out for a designer at some point along the way. An important note here, don't confuse this with an argument like the cosmological argument. This isn't about there being a first cause. This is about the apparent purposefulness of the functionality of the watch. That is the reason we determine, according to Paley, that there must have been a designer, not because failing to do so results in an infinite regress. Since there is an apparent design, Paley is basically arguing that the design requires a designer. He says there cannot be a design without a designer, a contrivance without a contriver. Deal of time talking about watches, but remember that this is an argument from analogy. Paley now invites us to consider living organisms. He points out that animals and plants are many times more complex than a watch, and we find that we must admit that watches are designed because of their functionality and complexity. Remember that he says that we would have to admit this even if we did not know what a watch was or how it was created. He therefore thinks that we need to acknowledge that plants and animals were designed. Likewise, because plants and animals are so much more complex than any watch, he thinks that we have to posit a much more grand designer than the kind who could create a watch. Namely, he thinks that we must posit God as a designer for plants and animals in order to explain their functionality and purposefulness of their parts. Before closing, I want to warn students away from some potential mistakes. First, Paley is arguing about the apparent purpose of living things only. Some people mistakenly think that he is arguing that the entire universe and everything in it requires a designer. That is not this argument. Remember, the rock doesn't call out for a designer. There are some modern versions of this argument called fine-tuning arguments, which claim that the universe as a whole seems to exhibit design, and we might briefly mention this later in the module. Also keep in mind the differences between this and the cosmological argument. There is no infinite regress involved here. It is the apparent purposefulness or functionality of an object that seemed to call out for a designer. And that about wraps up this presentation. Until next time.